I spent 2 days preparing the ranch for Lauren's visit, polishing the cedar table, setting out Margaret's old china, even baking the peach cobbler she used to beg for when she was little. I told myself this was how love stayed alive. You show up, you give, you keep the door open. She arrived just after dusk, but not alone. Dean trailed behind her, and then his parents, Harold and Evelyn, stepping onto my porch like conquerors. I still smiled. I still said, "Dinner's ready." But Lauren didn't sit. She looked at me the way a stranger would and said, "Dad, you shouldn't be here. The ranch, it belongs to us now." Dean smirked. Harold raised his glass in the chair I carved with my own hands. Evelyn called me selfish for keeping it empty, and Lauren's voice cut sharper than theirs. "You're alone now. Go rest in town. We'll handle things here." I didn't argue. I didn't smash the glass. I stood there in silence while the cobbler cooled on the counter, my heart pounding like I'd been erased from my own home. Weeks later, those same people were sitting in a courtroom, their laughter gone, their lies crumbling, as the judge read the one sentence that changed everything. "You won't believe how a daughter's betrayal turned a family dinner into a war that ended under oath. But before I take you through it, subscribe, so you don't miss the next gripping stories of betrayal and justice." Now let me take you back to the night I drove 3 hours across the desert, chasing the last streaks of daylight toward the ranch. The cobbler still sat cooling on the counter, untouched. I could smell the cinnamon and sugar every time the breeze shifted through the doorway, mocking me with the sweetness I had prepared for people who had already decided I didn't belong. My own daughter's words still rang in my head. "You're the guest now." Guest. In the house I built, on the land I worked, under the tree I planted with Margaret the year we said forever. I stood there on the porch, suitcase in hand, watching Harold sink deeper into the chair I had carved, his glass raised like he was christening new property. Dean leaned against the post, his smirk carved into stone. Evelyn looked around like a queen blessing her new kingdom, and Lauren, my daughter, my blood, folded her hands as if she were in church, her eyes steady, her tone soft, but final. "Get some rest in town, Dad. We'll handle things here." I didn't argue. I didn't flip the table. I didn't even touch the cobbler cooling inside. I swallowed the fire in my throat, stepped off the porch, and listened to Harold chuckle behind me. The sound clung like smoke. By the time I reached my truck, my shoulders had squared again. My hand clamped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, until the leather bore the marks of my grip. The headlights cut across the oak tree by the river, the one Margaret and I planted with our bare hands. Its branches swayed in the dusk wind, whispering a command louder than any words I could have spoken. "Don't let them erase you." As the tires chewed into the dirt road, the ranch shrinking in the rear view, memory forced itself into the silence, Margaret's laugh echoing through the hall. Lauren, barefoot on the porch, raspberry stains on her fingers as she shouted, "Daddy, look what I picked!" The swing I built creaked under her weight, summer after summer, until she was too old for it. That was the place I had been told no longer belonged to me. The porch where Margaret drank her tea, the rooms where we argued and reconciled, the field where I bled to fence the cattle. All of it dismissed with one word: guest. I drove on, dust curling behind me like smoke from a slow fire. My daughter thought she had won. Dean thought he had cemented his place as the man in charge. Harold and Evelyn thought entitlement would crown them rightful owners. But I knew something they didn't. A man stripped of everything doesn't vanish. He rebuilds, he sharpens, he waits, and he never forgets. The laughter from the porch still clung to me as I drove away, Harold's chuckle echoing like a nail being hammered into my skull. The cobbler I had baked for my daughter sat cooling on the counter, untouched. Guest. That's what she had called me. A guest in my own home. The word pressed itself against my chest heavier than the desert night. I rolled the window down just enough for the cold air to sting my face. The highway stretched forward, a dark ribbon swallowed by shadows, the painted dashes blinking like a metronome counting out grief. Every sound seemed too loud. The groan of the tires, the rattle under the chassis, the faint buzz of a dying country station. The smell of burnt rubber lingered, the taste of grit coating my tongue. My hands clenched the wheel until the leather cried. This wasn't the first time I'd gripped it that way. I remembered a different night, years back. Margaret beside me, moaning softly as contractions came faster than either of us had expected. The air had smelled of antiseptic and nerves when we reached the hospital, but then the doctor placed Lauren in my arms. Wrinkled, red, fragile, but perfect. She's ours. She'll never feel alone, I had whispered, and now that same girl had told me I didn't belong. A set of headlights flared in my windshield, blinding me. A semi barreled into my lane, horn bellowing like a war trumpet. I yanked the wheel, tires screaming against gravel before snapping back onto asphalt. My horn blared in return, swallowed instantly by desert silence. For a moment, the night was nothing but my heartbeat slamming inside my chest. I slowed, chest heaving, breath ragged. If the universe had wanted me awake, it had chosen its method well. At the next exit, I pulled into a diner lot where a flickering neon sign buzzed, "Open." Inside, it smelled of grease, old coffee, lemon cleaner. A waitress with tired eyes handed me a cup before I even asked. "Long drive?" she said, her voice worn but kind. "Longer than I planned." She wiped down the counter, eyes drifting toward the window. "Sometimes the road doesn't take us home, just away." Her words cut deep because she didn't know how true they were. I left cash under the cup, nodded once, and stepped back into the desert air. The coffee was bitter, but it steadied me. Back on the road, the silence grew heavier. To my right, the river shimmered like a silver blade under the moon. Margaret and I had once sat with our feet in that water, Lauren chasing fireflies, raspberry stains on her lips. Margaret had whispered, "She'll be strong, Tom, independent. She'll stand tall." Strong? Maybe. Independent. If betrayal could be mistaken for independence. But tall? No. Tonight she had made herself smaller than I thought possible. Small enough to let greed wear the mask of need. The phone buzzed on the seat beside me, its vibration whining like a mosquito in the cab. I didn't grab it right away. When it stilled, the screen glowed. "Don't come back. It's ours now." I barked a laugh, dry and sharp. Not humor, recognition. Even her cruelty was efficient. "No, please, no, I'm sorry. Just decree, like a queen banishing her subject." The miles fell away, each one tightening my jaw until my teeth ached. I glanced at the mirror. The reflection staring back wasn't the man who had once built fences with his bare hands or taught history to restless teenagers. It wasn't the husband who had carried Margaret's weight through chemo. It wasn't even the father who whispered promises into the ear of a newborn. It was the outline of a man chipped down by every yes, every time he swallowed his pride to avoid a fight. By the time I reached my small house in town, the porch light glowed, faithful to Margaret's old rule. A home should never greet you in darkness. Tonight, that light mocked me. I unlocked the door to silence. The air smelled of dust and absence. I set my suitcase down. The thud echoed too loud in the narrow hall. In the kitchen, I made coffee I didn't need, just to keep my hands moving. Steam fogged my glasses. I sat at the table, tracing the grain of the wood as if it might give me answers. The phone buzzed again. I didn't check. Instead, I reached for the leather notebook Margaret once kept tucked behind the bread box. The cover smelled faintly of old soil and grocery lists. I opened to a blank page and pressed my pen so hard it nearly tore through. They will regret this. The words weren't rage. They were clarity. Cold. Precise. The kind of clarity revolutions are born from. The house hummed. The refrigerator motor, the rattle of a shutter, branches tapping glass like fingers reminding me, don't let them erase you. Then the phone chimed again. This time, a voicemail. Against better judgment, I pressed play. Dean's voice oozed through the speaker, smug and venomous. "You think you can stop us? You can't even stop yourself. This place is ours now, old man. Don't bother trying." I leaned back, the words sinking like stones. My lips curled, not into grief, not into laughter, but into something harder. His arrogance wasn't just cruelty, it was evidence. Proof. I closed the notebook gently, sealing it like a pact. He thought I was finished. He didn't realize he had just handed me my opening move. The coffee had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. It tasted like resolve. And as the night stretched long and silent around me, one thought burned clear as the ink in that notebook. Tomorrow, the blueprint would begin. The house hummed its usual low noises: refrigerator, old clock, the settling sighs of a place that had lived a life. Outside, the wind threaded the oaks and sent a loose shutter skittering like an impatient foot. Inside, my kitchen was a still life. Margaret's recipe cards tucked into their tin, the salt shaker with its chipped corner, the leather notebook waiting like a clean page. Lauren's text sat on the screen like an accusation. "Dad, don't come back. We've decided it's better this way. Dean's parents need the ranch more than you do. It's ours now. Please don't make this harder." No comma where a softener might have been. No please that meant anything. Just sentence after sentence that read like law. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From the audacity of a daughter who could decide for herself that her father no longer belonged in the life he'd built. From the thought that the people I had welcomed into my home could sit at my table and say so with such calm. I wanted to call. I wanted the sound of her voice so I could hear. Maybe hear regret. Maybe hear her explain away the violence of her words. But I knew the cadence already. Measured, reasonable. The tone people use when they are rehearsed for being right. If I called, she'd hand me another polite blade. So I set the phone face down and let the vibration stop hiding in its quiet. The window above the sink framed the backyard in a rectangle of moonlight. The swing Margaret had braided rope for hung still, its chains whispering. For a second I could see her in the silver, her sweater pulled tight, hands tucked into her pockets, the way she'd look at me when she wanted me to be blunt. "Tom, boundaries," she'd say. "You can't let her take everything." Her warning rolled over me now like a tide I'd ignored. I poured another cup of coffee, black and sharp, and carried it into my study. The leather chair had the imprint of my years as plainly as a fossil. I slid open the drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad, the paper whispering as the pen broke the surface. At the top of the first page I wrote a single word and pressed the pen so hard it dented the wood beneath. Blueprint. The word felt like an oath. Not plan, not revenge. Blueprint. Built things last. Measured things survived. I had taught students to think in timelines and causes. There was no reason I couldn't apply the same ledgered logic to this mess of family and entitlement. Rule 1, I wrote. Never negotiate from desperation. That line was carved from the nights I swallowed my pride to keep the peace. For a semester, for a grade, for a wedding, for the quiet that Margaret sometimes needed. Desperation leaves you vulnerable. I'd been vulnerable for years. Not again. Rule 2. Control the information. Paper is louder than boasting. A recorded deed, a notarized letter, an eyewitness statement. These things do not change tone when someone claims hurt. They stand as evidence. I thought of Victor Chen, a kid once in my sophomore civics class, who argued history like it was a sport and later turned that hunger into law. Victor could read a document like a map to treasure. He was the one I would call. Rule 3. Own the timing. If they believed my silence was shame, let them rest in that delusion. Patience is a weapon. Let them settle, make mistakes, grow careless. Planting is easier when the soil is soft. Let them plant their flags first. I'd come later with something that rooted deeper. As I wrote, Memories threaded in and out without taking over. I saw Margaret in the garden, her elbows dusted with soil. I saw Lauren at 9, nose sticky with jam, shrieking with the unself-conscious joy of children. Those images didn't drown me. They tempered me. They were fuel for precision, not fireworks. My hand moved almost automatically as I added details. Phase 1, legal, title review, trust restructuring, irrevocable gift if necessary. Phase 2, psychological, make the space inhospitable to squatters without breaking laws. Phase 3, public, reframe the story as stewardship, community, and dignity. Each phase sat on the page like an engineered beam supporting the roof of an eventual outcome. The house ticked on. I paused, pen poised, and listened to the night. Somewhere 2 streets over, a dog barked, the ordinary life of people who hadn't just been told their guest status. It was ridiculous how small things steadied me. The pen's weight, the paper's texture, the light on the mantel. I breathed in and felt something settle into place. The cool, patient kind of anger that doesn't burn everything it touches. The phone buzzed. I let it. The screen lit with another message from Lauren. This time the tone was different. Flatter, as if rehearsed to sound reasonable. "Dad, please don't embarrass yourself. Accept this. It's better for everyone." I laughed then. It was a short, low sound, and I could hear the old classroom in it, the way laughter sharpens a point. "Embarrass myself," she wrote, as if asking a man to shrink were kindness. I put the pen down and opened the drawer where I kept a thin stack of deeds and old tax receipts, paper that smelled faintly of county clerks and ink. I pulled out the ranch deed, my name still clear in my hand. I read the words twice, then 3 times, as if reading aloud would make the terms more real. The letters were steady under my thumb. The paper did not flinch. Then I did something I hadn't done since our first mortgage payment. I reached for the phone and dialed Victor. The line clicked once. His voice, older, still precise, came through, sardonic as ever. "Thomas Gray, if this is about grading my petition on 19th century taxation, I'll have you know I aced it." "No essays today," I said. My voice was even. "I need help making sure something I give away can't be taken." There was a pause long enough for me to hear the office's small noises, someone typing, a muffled conversation. When Victor answered, the edge in his voice was all business. "Bring me every paper you have. Deed, insurance, any correspondence. Come by this afternoon. I'll clear my calendar." Relief flickered in my chest. The clean, pragmatic relief of a man trading fury for work. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," Victor replied. "Just bring it, and Thomas, be ready. This isn't an afternoon's fix, it's a campaign." The last word landed heavy and oddly satisfying. I hung up and sat back. The notebook lay open on the desk, the ink curling into the fibers. Something like purpose moved through me, small and focused. Not vengeance for vengeance's sake, but structure, measured measures that would not only stop them from taking the house, but strip the moral center from the audacity that let them try. I took one more look around the study, the framed photograph of Margaret beaming in the sun, the stack of yellow pads with my sloppy handwriting, and stood. I switched off the lamp. The house sank into a softer dark. On the porch, the swing creaked once and stopped. Tomorrow, I would go to Victor. Tomorrow, I would begin to build the walls they could not breach. Tonight, the blueprint rested like a promise on the paper. Careful, patient, immovable. They thought they'd won. They had only declared war. Victor cleared his calendar. I had a meeting at 2. The pen lay on the page like a small, lethal thing. I slid the notebook into the drawer, and for the first time since Margaret died, slept knowing the next move. The next morning, I shaved for the first time in weeks. The razor scraped across my jaw with a sound that felt too loud in the quiet house, as if I were cutting away more than stubble. I pulled on the only navy blazer that still fit, Knotted the red and gray striped tie Margaret once said made me look like a man who meant every word he spoke. I hadn't dressed like this since her funeral. But today wasn't about mourning. Today was about building walls. Walls they wouldn't see until they smashed into them. Victor Chen's office sat on the 10th floor of a glass tower downtown. The place smelled faintly of polished marble and roasted coffee, the kind of atmosphere that made you check your posture. When I stepped out of the elevator, I saw rows of framed law journals, everything neat, expensive, deliberate. I hadn't seen Victor in a decade, not since he'd stood at a retirement party in a sharp suit, telling colleagues I was the teacher who taught him how to argue with history. He rose as I entered, hand extended, firm grip, sharp eyes. "Mr. Gray," he said, with the ghost of a smile. "Didn't think I'd ever see you in here." "Call me Thomas," I told him. "This isn't a classroom anymore." He gestured toward the leather chair across his desk. "Then sit, Thomas. Tell me what's happening." I sat down, leaned forward. "My daughter and her husband are taking my ranch. They've moved Dean's parents in. Told me not to come back." His pen froze mid-stroke. "Is the deed in your name?" "It is. Bought outright 25 years ago. My wife and I." Victor nodded, pen tapping the pad. "Family disputes, deeper than contracts. But the law doesn't bend just because someone feels entitled. We can reinforce your ownership. Title review, restructure the trust, add protective covenants. Paper walls, thin until you walk into one, then unbreakable." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of warmth. Someone still believed I had the right to stand tall. "How fast can we move?" I asked. He studied me. "Fast enough. But Thomas, hear me. Once we put these protections in place, you're drawing a line your daughter can't cross. You may not get her back." I thought of Lauren's message. "It's ours now. Don't make this harder." My jaw tightened. The line was already drawn. "I'm just fortifying it." Respect flickered in his eyes. "Bring me every document, deeds, tax records, insurance. We'll start today." I walked out with a heavy folder under my arm, sunlight bouncing off the mirrored walls of the lobby. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt something other than loss. I felt purpose. I didn't drive home. I turned left at the church and headed 2 blocks down to a sagging white bungalow behind a crooked fence, Clara's house. She opened the door before my knuckles landed a second time, glasses slipping down her nose, fingers streaked with grease. "Thomas Gray," she said, brows arched. "What brings you here?" "Don't tell me your Wi-Fi's down again. Not this time." I stepped into a living room that looked like a command center. Monitors stacked high, cables crawling across the carpet, the whine of cooling fans filling the air. "I need your help with something unusual." "Unusual how?" she asked, half amused. "I need to make a house defend itself." She laughed, quick and bright. "What is this, Home Alone? Paint cans swinging on ropes? Blowtorches on doorknobs?" "Not like that." I moved deeper into the clutter, stepping over a coil of wire. Lights that disorient, sounds that come from nowhere, water systems that burst open on command. A place that refuses to be lived in unless you belong there. Her smile faded, replaced by something sharper. "You're talking psychological warfare." I nodded. "I want them gone, and I want them never to come back." She crossed her arms, studying me, her clear eyes drilling into mine. "You're serious?" "As serious as I've ever been." Clara paced, muttering to herself. Motion sensors could trigger strobe lights, speakers in vents, directional audio, whispers only they hear, projectors on the stairs, shadows moving where no one is. I've got modules to flood sinks or showers instantly. She stopped, turned back with a grin tugging her mouth. "We could make that ranch look haunted." "Haunted is exactly what I need." Her grin spread. She clapped her hands once. "All right, give me access, I'll bring the toys. But hear me? Once it's set up, it'll feel real. Even to you. That's fine. I don't scare easy anymore. She gave me a long look, as though checking if there was anything left in me that still could be scared. Then she nodded. Come back tomorrow morning. We'll load up. That night in my study, I spread Victor's legal folder and Clara's scribbled notes across the desk. One side of the desk, paper protections, invisible walls. The other, psychological warfare, shadows and noise and water on command. I traced my finger between the two piles like I was drawing a battle map. Lauren thought declaring it was enough. Dean thought swagger made him the owner. Harold and Evelyn thought entitlement was the same as law. None of them had accounted for me, the man they thought too worn out to fight. The father who'd lived patient had turned calculating. The wind rattled the windows. The oak tree creaked, its shadow sliding across the floor. For a moment I swore I heard Margaret's voice, calm and approving. Measure twice. Cut once. I leaned back, closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't consumed by despair. I was preparing. At 11 that night, my phone buzzed, a voicemail. I hit play, and Dean's voice spilled out, smug and slurred with whiskey. Go ahead, old man. Bring whatever tricks you've got. This house is ours now. You can't scare us off. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just dared me into the very thing I was already building. Tomorrow, Clara and I would begin, and the ranch would no longer be their sanctuary. It would become their nightmare. I liked the feel of the night at the ranch after we left it. The quiet wasn't empty so much as charged, as though the place itself was holding its breath. Clara and I drove back with crates of equipment balanced between us, the SUV heater drying the chill off our hands. She hummed softly at each bump in the road, lost in thoughts about sensor thresholds and trigger sequences. I kept my eyes on the oak tree rising and falling against the moon as we turned up the gravel drive. For the first time since that night on the porch, the ranch didn't look stolen. It looked like a stage waiting for my direction. We unloaded fast. Clara worked with the discipline of someone who'd been building systems her whole life. I carried cases up the porch while she slid a ladder against the siding. The back door opened to the smell of lemon oil and old wood. Margaret's scent, still clinging. My chest tightened at the memory of her throw folded across the couch. I wanted to reach for it, to breathe her in again. Instead, I mounted a motion sensor where her knitting basket used to sit. The small act like replacing tenderness with calculation. Clara unpacked her tools, projectors the size of shoeboxes, smoke machines compact enough to slide under a bench, directional speakers tucked into cases, coils of LED strips, and a handful of smooth white domes. Multi-sensor units tuned to motion, heat, vibration. She laid each down with a craftsman's care. We'll keep everything reversible, she said. The word hung strangely in the room. Reversible didn't erase the intent, but it dulled the edge. It made me feel less like I was desecrating Margaret's house, and more like I was defending it. Her voice ran steady as she mapped the design. Entryway trips the strobe in the living room. Upstairs landing, projectors throw a silhouette that paces. Directional audio at the foyer, whispers only to the person standing there. You shouldn't be here. Not everyone hears it. That's the first crack. She smiled with the satisfaction of solving a riddle. Plumbing valves tied into relays. Let someone linger in the kitchen too long. 30 seconds later, every faucet erupts. Panic without proof. You're sure it's safe? I asked. The question carried more weight than I intended. As safe as a bad dream, she said. Low voltage, clean valves, no danger, no lawsuits. We scare them out, not harm them. Her eyes locked on mine. You really okay with that? I nodded once. I am. Room by room we worked, threading wires behind shelves, tucking speakers into vents, setting nodes above doors. Clara slid beneath the kitchen sink and bolted in a valve with the precision of a surgeon. When she fired up a projector on the landing, the beam cast a tall, distorted shadow across the wall. It moved wrong, too tall, the edges blurred. My pulse thumped quick. I wasn't afraid, But something primal stirred anyway. The house was beginning to breathe again. The real genius lay in choreography. Clara worked at her tablet, layering delays and sensitivities into a sequence. It has to start like coincidence, she explained. A flicker, a plumbing quirk, then escalate one layer on top of another, until it's no longer a house. People trust houses. When the house betrays them, they run. We tested the system in the living room. I stood at the doorway as Clara tapped a command. The lights stuttered in a rhythm that felt wrong to my eyes, strobe spilling across walls. A whisper curled directly into my right ear, "You shouldn't be here." I spun, but there was nothing. Then the faucet hissed, spraying a mist of warm water into the air. The effect crawled across my skin. Clara chuckled, low and pleased. "Perfect. They'll swear the place is alive." When we left that night, the ranch looked untouched. No wires, no hidden boxes. To anyone else, it was the same home it had always been. But Clara and I knew better. It was a set, rigged and ready. In my truck, exhaustion settled in like the weight of a finished blueprint. I nodded off with her tablet balanced on my knee, rereading the sequence names she'd given each trick. Entry siren, landing walker, kitchen flood. They sounded like chapters in a darker book only we had the key to. The first days of their move-in were mundane. I watched through the camera feeds from my study in town, pretending to read while my ears stayed tuned to the audio streams. Dean swaggered through the house, hanging pictures crookedly, hammer echoing like victory drums. Lauren stacked linens and candles, as if staging a life for photographs. Harold polished his boots at the kitchen table, as though entitlement alone made him lord of the place. Evelyn set out her pearls on Margaret's counter, like draping a crown over someone else's portrait. We waited. Patience was the soul of it. A good haunt doesn't rush. On the third night, 9:12 sharp, the living room lights fluttered. Harold frowned. A minute later, the foyer whispered, "Leave." Only he heard it. His face stiffened, eyes darting. But he said nothing. At 9:14, the upstairs projector painted a long shadow pacing at the landing. Evelyn let out a small sound, hand over her mouth. Dean smirked. "Reflection from the lake," he said, brushing it off. At 10:03, the kitchen faucets roared open, water pounding metal. Evelyn scrambled in, clutching towels. Dean stormed to the breaker box, cursing, but the water kept running until it cut out on its own. The whisper came again, this time layered with a faint child's hum, a tune Lauren used to sing swinging barefoot on the porch. That sound folded the air tight. Evelyn sat down on the stairs, trembling. Harold pressed a hand to his chest. Dean called a technician the next morning. The man ran his diagnostics and shrugged. "System's clean," he said. "Sometimes smart wiring glitches." But the house didn't stop. Each night Clara adjusted, subtle as a puppeteer. Shadows tilting differently, whispers pitched lower, faucets erupting later. The unpredictability gnawed at them. People can endure hardship. They cannot endure uncertainty. Harold began walking with a hand braced against the wall, muttering about dizziness. Evelyn's pearls stayed in their box. Dean prowled the porch at midnight, flashlight sweeping, trying to catch ghosts that weren't there. Lauren stared longer into mirrors than out at the lake. They left one weekend with bags in the trunk, called it a break. They returned 2 days later, forced smiles stiff on their faces. The house welcomed them back the only way it knew, by betraying them again. 2 weeks in, their certainty had cracked like old plaster. Dean's bravado thinned, his voice a little too sharp when he tried to joke. Lauren's eyes looked hollow in the camera feeds, darting at every flicker. Harold and Evelyn moved slowly, like people wading through fog. The ranch no longer felt like theirs. It didn't feel like home at all. And that was the point. They came back on a Thursday afternoon, just before sunset. I saw them on the feed before I heard the tires on the gravel. A slow, deliberate roll, like people who expect the world to bend around them. Dean's jaw was a line of stone. Lauren held her phone so tight her knuckles were white. Harold and Evelyn followed behind, stiff and immaculate, as if dignity could be ironed into a shirt. Dean had a man with him this time. The camera caught the silver toolbox swinging from his hand as they climbed the steps. A locksmith by the look of him. Work-worn boots, grease on his fingers, an attitude narrowed down to a task. He crouched at the door, fingers tracing the lock with the efficient disinterest of a man who opens, fixes, and moves on. The porch mic picked up his low mutter. "These aren't regular locks, sir. Integrated system, biometric, wireless, backup power. You can't just swap them out like a deadbolt." "Then force it," Dean snapped. The locksmith straightened, closed his toolbox with a calm snap, and shook his head. "Not my area. You'll need an automation specialist." His boots crunched away over the gravel. He didn't look back. Lauren's voice cut sharp, thin as glass. "You told me this would be easy. You said Dad wouldn't fight." Dean rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking toward the porch-mounted camera, though he had no idea it was watching. "He's bluffing. It's just glitches. We'll outlast him." The camera caught the tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth. The kind of micro-movement men show when certainty starts to fray. That night they stayed. They had to. Pride doesn't fold on the porch. And every sensor we'd armed waited, patient as a trap. Clara's system needed no prompting from me. At 9:47, the guest room projector threw a lanky silhouette across the wall. Patricia screamed and clutched at her chest. At 10:10, water blasted from faucets throughout the house, silver arcs painting the sink basins. At 10:15, Harold coughed and pressed a trembling hand to his throat, begging for quiet as whispers slid down the hall like smoke. Lauren called me at 10:30. The phone lit my kitchen table, green and insistent. I watched her name, thumb hovering, and let it ring until it died. Some calls sharpen knives, some calls just hand you the handle. The next morning, 2 patrol cars were parked under the oak, blue and white, lights off, engines idling like distant waves. The officers walked the house in scuffed shoes, hands at their sides. I watched them move from room to room on the feed, saw them touch the walls, look up at the ceiling, and crouch to examine sockets. One of them, a younger man with tired eyes, shrugged to his partner. "Looks clean," he said. "Smart system acting up." "Not our jurisdiction." His voice was the same kind of neutral you hear in rooms where people are trained not to feel. Dean followed them out to the porch, shoulders carved by frustration. "So what? My father-in-law gets to terrorize us and you just leave?" he demanded. The older officer looked at him like the question was softer than he expected. "We don't see a crime here," he said. "We document. If there's a break-in or wires cut or someone injured, sure. But right now, looks like a smart home behaving badly. Call an electrician." They left with the polite distance of people who have seen domestic storms before and learned to keep out of the wind. Lauren's face folded in slow grief, but it wasn't fear. It was humiliation. She'd expected the law to be an ally. Instead, it shrugged. I saw something like recognition pass over her features. The sick dawning that the world wouldn't necessarily validate what she thought she deserved. Inside the house, the division deepened. The kitchen camera caught far more than they realized. Dean pacing, hands rubbing the same spot on his forehead. Lauren folding and refolding a dish towel as though neatness could stitch a wound. Their words were a hiss, private venom made public in grainy pixels. "You married me for that ranch," Lauren spat, the words breaking free with a betrayal of their own. Dean stopped mid-step as if he'd been jabbed. Then he let out a laugh, but it was brittle. "Don't act surprised. You knew what you brought to the table. Your dad was the wallet. You were the key." Lauren's fingers trembled on the towel. "You don't love me?" she asked, but it was less a plea than a test. Dean's silence filled the room like a storm cloud. When he answered finally, it was low and cruel. "Love doesn't pay mortgages." Evelyn drifted into the doorway carrying a glass of wine, pretending not to be listening, but her eyes betrayed her. Half pity, half-cold approval. Harold muttered from his chair, "Don't pick a fight you can't win," like someone reciting instructions for battle he expected to watch from the sidelines. The ranch had stopped being just property. It was exposing them, peeling back the veneers they'd wrapped themselves in. Their performance was unstitched on camera for anyone who looked. I sat in my study miles away, the tablet's glow painting my face pale. The coffee beside me had gone bitter and cold, but I hardly noticed. The feed showed my daughter in a kitchen I'd built, shoulders rounding, the slackening of a woman who'd been sold a version of love tied to a ledger. It should have cut me, but instead it clarified something I'd been afraid to say. This wasn't simple greed. It was rot. A rot that spread from entitlement to intimacy, eating at trust and leaving only contracts where warmth should be. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see the damage. Perhaps the small knife in her chest was finally warm enough to thaw denial. 2 days later, they tried again. A technician arrived with a laptop and a roll of diagnostic tools, blinking like someone who'd come to fix a radio. He poked and prodded, ran a battery of tests, scrolled through logs, muttered about firmware and phantom signals. He left after an hour with the same shrug. Nothing illegal, nothing to fix. The systems were clean, obedient to their code, responsive only to the triggers we'd set. That night, at 2 a.m, Clara ran a sequence that folded like a final act. The house woke with a layered roar, lights stuttering, a chorus of faucets, shadows that moved like living things. Patricia's scream rang out sharp in the dark. Dean raged into the ceiling, fists slamming drywall. He punched a wall with the kind of desperation that leaves a print. Lauren curled into herself on the couch and whispered into the darkness, "Make it stop." But I didn't. The point never was simple cruelty. It was demonstration. I wanted them to understand, in a way they couldn't ignore, that possession is not the same thing as belonging. Keys don't bequeath loyalty. Deeds don't purchase decency. I wanted the house to say what they refused to hear with words. By Sunday, they packed bags and left for a motel a town away. The ranch sat empty and patient. The kind of silence that feels like an animal watching from the edge of the woods. I sat at my table and wrote on the legal pad in thick letters, the ink depressions biting the paper. They are breaking, not just leaving. Breaking. The blueprint was working. The psychological campaign had peeled back the gloss, revealing fault lines. But I knew this was not the end. People like Dean don't yield to discomfort. They respond to pressure. They would come back armed with sharper tools. Lawyers making claims, threats tossed like grenades, ultimatums wrapped in civic language. I sipped the cold coffee and let the bitterness sit on my tongue. Margaret would have told me not to revel, to be steady and fair. She would have said the work was to protect, not to punish. So I steadied myself. The haunted nights had done their work. Now came the part that would make the result permanent. Law, records, permanence. The house could harry them until they fled. The law would make sure they could not simply come back with a new swagger. Outside the window, the oak's branches swayed and tapped at the glass, like fingers checking a pulse. I set the pen down and reached for my phone. Victor would be ready. I could feel it. There were motions to put in place, affidavits to collect, deeds to record. The next move would be public, final, and quiet all at once. I pushed my chair in, stood, and walked to the window. In the darkness across the lawn, the ranch waited, patient, watchful, owned by more than paper now. The war had moved from the shadows into the light. The phone on my desk buzzed with the rhythm of insistence, the way people call when they've convinced themselves that repetition is power. I let it ring. Victor had told me once, paper is louder than shouting. I believed him. So I kept the phone dark, silent, and reached into the drawer where the certified forms rested. 2 neat stacks, embossed seals pressed into the fibers so firmly you could feel them like scars. The faint smell of ink and county office polish rose when I lifted the top sheet. For months my life had narrowed into rituals. Coffee black in the same chipped mug at dawn. A slow walk around the yard at noon. A chair pulled out to the exact place where Margaret once sat knitting. They'd felt hollow before. Now they were prelude. The papers were the hinge on which the whole affair would turn. Not just defense, not just resistance, but closure. Victor had worked quickly. He'd always been sharp, meticulous, once the kind of student who argued history with precision until silence in the room meant surrender. Now his precision was law. He'd drawn up a deed transfer and a charitable gift agreement to the Riverbend Conservation Trust, a local nonprofit that preserved rural land for education, youth programs, and conservation. The transfer was airtight, irrevocable, but within it was the clause I'd asked for: lifetime honorary access for Thomas Gray, revocable only by me, never by anyone else. It was clean language, surgical in its fairness. "You'll still be able to use the ranch," Victor had said when we finalized the draft. "Retreats, visits, weekends under the oak, but legally it won't be an asset anyone can fight over. It'll be legacy, untouchable." He'd explained tax codes and county timelines, the way clerks shuffle documents into permanence. He'd said it with the steady tone of a surgeon explaining a necessary cut. The first stroke of my pen came easy. No tremor, no second thought. The nib whispered across the page, letters forming with deliberate weight. At the bottom, my name stood in ink, the color of judgment. When Victor walked the documents into the county recorder the next morning, the clerk stamped them with a practiced thud. In that sterile office, it sounded like a gavel coming down. That afternoon, I sat in my study and watched the feed of the ranch. The house glowed under a pale blue sky, quiet, composed. It looked less like a battlefield and more like an heirloom placed safely behind glass. For a moment, I had the ridiculous urge to go back inside and straighten a cushion, to lay Margaret's throw back over the sofa. But this wasn't about furniture. It was about memory safeguarded from the greedy hands of the present. News traveled faster than I expected. Victor had nudged the Trust's communications team to publish a press note once the filings were recorded. By sunrise, Riverbend's website bore a photo of the ranch with a simple headline: "A gift of land for future generations." The statement below spoke of stewardship, healing, and community. It mentioned Margaret's name, and it mentioned mine, alongside the donor clause that preserved my access. The first call came before breakfast. Dean's voice spilled out hot and ragged on the speakerphone. "You gave it away? You can't do that. That property is—" He broke off, maybe realizing the danger of finishing the sentence with "ours." "I did," I said flatly. "I gave it to people who will honor it. You can hire lawyers. You can write threats. The deed is recorded." There was a long silence, full of static and breath. Then Lauren's voice, softer, brittle. "Dad, please, this isn't the way we can—" Her words faltered, searching for a shape that might sound like grief, but never found footing. Victor had warned me. Pride lashes first. Not lawsuits, not police, not even violence. Pride. Words thrown like knives because words cost less than surrender. So when local gossip started to ripple, neighbors texting, a county blog posting a short article, I didn't flinch. Some voices praised the gift. Others speculated on motives. But the dominant thread was simple: generosity, community, memory preserved. Dean's outrage couldn't compete with that. Lauren's wounded indignation looked small beside it. A week later, Victor called a meeting. Formal, deliberate, his firm's conference room, tall windows pouring daylight across polished wood. Dean arrived with Lauren at his side, Harold and Evelyn just behind. They sat together, a wall of grievance. I sat opposite, Victor at my left, a binder of recorded documents between us like a moat. Lauren spoke first, her eyes rimmed red. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" Her voice strained, carrying both accusation and a plea for recognition. What she wanted was for me to admit I'd considered her feelings, weighed them against the land, chosen poorly. She wanted to be the wronged daughter, not the trespasser. I held her gaze. I did tell you. I told you not to move in without asking. I asked for respect. You gave me eviction notices instead of conversation. I gave the ranch to people who will keep it alive. That way, it won't be sold to the highest bidder or used as a trophy. My words didn't rise. They didn't need to. Harold leaned forward, bluster puffing his chest. You can't just hand away a family heirloom to strangers, he snapped. Evelyn's lips pinched, eyes narrowing. Dean's fingers drummed against the table, faster, sharper. They argued from entitlement, from the belief that wanting something creates rights. Victor opened the binder and slid a copy of the deed across the table. This is on record, he said. The transfer is lawful. It cannot be reversed without cause. Mr. Gray has retained donor access, use rights, not ownership. No one else holds claim. His calm was surgical, his tone like cold iron. Dean's voice rose, desperate. We'll fight it. We'll go to court. Undue influence. You pushed him. He jabbed a finger at me, as though pointing could change the law. Victor didn't blink. Prove it, he said. Bring lawyers, bring motions, bring filings. But the law requires evidence of coercion. Hurt feelings don't count. There is no evidence. Each word was a hammerhead driving nails into the coffin of Dean's certainty. They left in silence, heavier than shouting. In the parking lot, Harold turned to Dean and muttered something low. Dean's jaw clenched, his eyes burning. Lauren lingered at the door a second longer, looking at me with something rawer than fury. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was recognition. Then she was gone. The days that followed were quiet in ways I hadn't expected. They called twice, voicemails shifting from threats to pleading, but the calls went unanswered. No suits were filed, no papers delivered. Pride had run out of rope. Meanwhile, Riverbend Trust began moving forward. Plans for stewardship weekends, a classroom by the lake, a plaque beneath the oak with Margaret's name etched into steel. Community meetings hummed with energy. People clapped, asked questions, offered support. What had been my burden had become a shared promise. On the morning the plaque was unveiled, the lake lay flat and silver under the sun. Donna Ortiz, Riverbend's director, stood beside me as we drew back the cloth. The inscription caught the light. In memory of Margaret Gray, may this land be a quiet place of healing and learning. The crowd murmured, some wiping eyes, some nodding silently. My throat closed for a moment, but it wasn't the choke of grief. It was steadier, like the grounding of a foundation finally set. A reporter asked for a statement. I kept it simple. This place was built with love. It will be used for love again. Short sentences, honest ones, the kind you don't have to defend. Lauren called 2 months later, just once. Her voice was quieter, worn. I'm trying to understand, she said. I'm sorry for how I behaved. The words weren't grand. They weren't enough to erase the fracture, but they were real, and real is rare. Start small, I told her. Understand first, then ask. I didn't offer reconciliation, didn't promise anything more than possibility. The rest was hers to carry. Later that week I drove to the ranch alone. The oak stretched its shadow long across the yard. The plaque gleamed where the light touched it. Margaret's name etched permanent against stone and steel. Inside, the room still held her fingerprints. Herbs on the sill, the faint smell of lemon oil in the grain. I ran a hand along the windowsill and felt, for the first time in years, not loss, but peace. The battle was over. The walls of law stood higher than any tricks of sound or light. Dean and his family had been not just pushed out, but exposed for what they were. People mistaking inheritance for ownership, love for leverage. The ranch had been given back to something larger, something truer. As I stood on the porch watching the sun slip behind the trees, I felt the shape of victory settle. It wasn't loud, and it didn't need to be. It was final enough to keep the wrong people out. Generous enough to let the right people in. Somewhere inside that silence, Softer things began to grow again. Not forgiveness exactly, but the kind of quiet that lets you keep what matters without strangling it in your grip. The plaque under the oak tree had only been unveiled a week when the letter arrived. Heavy paper, embossed return address from a law office in the city. I slid it open with the same pocket knife I'd once used to carve Margaret's initials into the railing of the porch. The words inside were as sharp as any blade. Petition for injunction. Dean and Harold weren't finished. They had found someone to argue that my gift to the Riverbend Conservation Trust had been coerced, that I wasn't of sound mind. They wanted the transfer frozen, the deed dragged back into limbo. For a moment, the old tremor returned to my hands. To be accused of madness, of weakness, that was sharper than theft. But I forced a breath deep into my lungs and steadied myself. This was their last card, the bottom of the deck, and I had one left too. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a paneled room that smelled of varnish and old paper. Sunlight fell in fractured beams across the floor. I wore my navy blazer again. The one Margaret once said made me look like I meant every word. Across from me sat Dean in a new suit that didn't quite fit. Harold with his chin angled skyward, Evelyn tight-lipped and sour. Lauren sat between them, shoulders drawn in, her eyes pinned to the table. Their lawyer went first, spinning a story about an old man manipulated by outsiders and charities with agendas. He gestured toward me with the faux gentleness of someone handling fragile glass. "This is not generosity," he said. "This is coercion. A vulnerable man pushed into decisions he could not comprehend." The judge listened, expression unreadable, then turned to Victor. My lawyer rose with calm, deliberate steps, carrying a folder as though it weighed nothing. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "we submit notarized evaluations from 2 independent physicians confirming Mr. Gray's full cognitive capacity at the time of the transfer. Here are his signed instructions, email records, and witness statements from the Trust's board. And here..." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather notebook worn at the edges. "Is Mr. Gray's own log, dated weeks before the transfer, outlining his exact intentions. Written in his own hand." The notebook landed on the table with a soft thud. The page on top was mine. The words stared back at me in my handwriting. "They will regret this." The judge flipped through the papers, lips tightening slightly, but otherwise gave nothing away. Across the aisle, Dean's face went pale. Harold leaned forward, whispering furiously into his son-in-law's ear. Evelyn shook her head, pearls rattling faintly with the motion. Then Victor delivered the cut they hadn't seen coming. "We'd also like to submit evidence of financial motive," he said. "Records show Mr. Whitaker defaulted on a private loan 3 months before attempting to occupy the Gray Ranch. Further, testimony from Ms. Malcolm, Lauren Whitaker, confirms repeated statements from her husband emphasizing property as the primary motivation for their marriage." The words cracked like a whip. Gasps murmured through the small courtroom. Lauren's head jerked up, eyes wide, color draining from her face. She hadn't expected that deposition to see the light of day. Dean stammered, his voice stumbling over itself. That's not true, that's..." But Lauren's voice cut through, fragile but steady. "It is," she whispered. A silence fell so complete that it made her words echo. Dean sagged into his chair as if the bones had left him. Harold muttered a curse. Evelyn pressed her lips into a thin white line. The judge leaned forward, voice firm. "The petition is denied. The transfer stands, and I strongly advise the petitioners not to waste this court's time again." The gavel fell. Final. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air was sharp with the smell of turning leaves. Reporters clustered near the steps, snapping photos of Victor, of me, of papers with the Riverbend Trust logo. Dean shoved past, face tight with rage and shame. Harold stormed down the sidewalk, Evelyn snapping something sharp at his side. Lauren lingered. She moved slowly, as though crossing a fragile bridge. When she reached me, her voice was thin. "I didn't know he'd use my words like that," she said. But I guess the truth had to come out. I studied her. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, stripped of certainty. Truth always surfaces, I said, even when it hurts. Her eyes glistened. Dad, I can't undo what I did. No, I said, my voice even. But you can stop repeating it. She nodded once, trembling, and walked away alone. Weeks passed, and the ranch came alive again. Children built birdhouses under the oak, their paint-smeared hands busy with bright colors. College students ran soil tests in the meadow. The trust installed trails with small interpretive signs, metal posts glinting in the sunlight. It was no longer mine, but it was safe. That was enough. My honorary access was a quiet key I carried, and I used it often. I would sit under Margaret's tree, listening to the river hum, watching the light shift over the fields. It wasn't ownership anymore. It was belonging of another kind. One evening, near dusk, I saw Lauren again. She stood by the fence watching a group of children pack up their supplies. She didn't approach, didn't call out. She only watched, her face shadowed and thoughtful. For the first time in years, I felt something toward her that wasn't anger. Not forgiveness yet, but the first fragile step toward hope. As the sun bled into the river that night, I traced my fingers over the plaque. Margaret's name gleamed in the fading light. They tried, Maggie, I murmured. They tried everything, force, fear, even the law. But in the end, we won. Not with fists, not with fury, with something stronger. The oak stirred above me, its branches shifting as if in answer. For the first time in a long time, I breathed deep without bitterness. The family was fractured. Maybe it always would be. But the ranch was whole. The memory was preserved. The dignity remained unbroken. Bittersweet, yes, but sweeter than I'd ever dared hope. Looking back, I still wonder if my silence played a part in all of this. After Margaret passed, I thought giving Lauren everything she asked for was love. Maybe I mistook sacrifice for presence. Maybe in trying to keep peace, I taught her my voice could be ignored. And when the time came, she believed me. She believed I had no voice at all. That lesson can't be undone. But life doesn't always ask us to undo. Sometimes it just asks us to learn, to carry the stone in our pocket and let it remind us of what not to repeat. Silence has its cost. Yes. But so does honesty withheld too long. Now the ranch hums with new life. Children laugh under the oak, chasing each other with paint on their fingers. Students kneel in the soil with notebooks, testing roots and riverbeds. Families stroll the trails, voices weaving into the wind. It doesn't belong to me anymore, not in the legal sense, but it belongs to memory, to legacy, to the future. And in a way, that's more enduring than possession. Sometimes I see Lauren at the fence line. She doesn't always come over, but her eyes are softer now, her steps slower. We exchange small words, the kind that don't heal everything, but keep a path open. It's not forgiveness yet, but it's not silence either. That, in itself, is something. When I sit on the bench beneath Margaret's tree, I hear the river, the laughter, the wind through the leaves. For a long time, those sounds were drowned out by bitterness. Now they feel like music again. Margaret once told me, a home isn't walls, it's the life that fills it. She was right. The ranch is full again, and so am I in a quieter way. If my story finds you, let it be a reminder. Don't wait too long to speak. Don't let love be buried under silence. Even a clumsy word, offered in time, can keep a wound from deepening. Take care of yourselves. May the night close gently around you, not heavy with regret, but touched with peace. And may the places you love, and the people you love, remain alive with laughter.